Good afternoon. My name is Dana Bowen Matthew. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm Dean of the George Washington University Law School. I have the privilege this afternoon of welcoming you to this incredible event that's been 4 years at least in the making. And I thank you for joining me for a program celebrating the book release of one of our law school's great alumni, Jared Fishman, the founder and executive director of the Justice Innovation Lab. Our newly chartered Equity Institute is proud to co-host this exciting program with the Justice Innovation Lab, which is doing transformational work across the country to find solutions to inequalities in the criminal justice system. Now, if you've seen me speak ever before, you know I go off script. I usually take a little bit longer than the second paragraph. But I didn't write that. It's about one of the biggest understatements that I've made today. It is doing more than just finding solutions to the inequalities in our criminal justice system. They are looking to use big data to dismantle mass incarceration and gross systemic racism. That's how I would articulate it. The Justice Innovation Lab and the Equity Institute launched a partnership because they are committed as the Justice Innovation Lab at Jill at GW, to that dismantling of systematic racism. Together with Professor Donald Brayman, Jared Fishman has formed a unique partnership that delivers not only data-informed projects, but teaches students how to participate in this important dismantling in one of the most important and effective courses in our curriculum. The feedback from students participating in Jill at GW has been extremely positive, and it gives me great hope for the future. Let me share just a few quotes from our students. One, "It's a fulfilling experience that reminded me why I came to law school in the first place." Another, "I learned and developed practical skills. I know I'll be a better lawyer and, as a matter of fact, a better human being." One more, "I want to take what I've learned and fight for change in this country." So from the perspective of a dean and the perspective of an educator, this is exactly the kind of course and reaction that you'd like to see, because our true legacy is to equip an army of change agents who are passionate, who understand that law is a tool for justice and are prepared to use it. And that's what Jill is doing. They reduce harm in specific situations. I'm going to give you just a summary of a couple that the course and its leaders, Jared and Don, have been effective in. The Disparity in Prosecution in Charleston, South Carolina report, which they authored, finds that large racial differences in cases that come to the solicitor's office through arrests by law enforcement can be addressed this way. Though Black individuals make up only 12% of Charleston's population, they make up 53% of the people who were arrested in 2019 and entered the legal system. Yeah, I heard somebody say, wow, exactly. The difference in arrest rates is particularly pronounced in the enforcement of drug laws, where Black men are 6 times more likely to be charged by law enforcement with a drug offense than white men. This disproportionality in arrests cannot be explained by differences in behavior alone and may reflect the impacts of law enforcement practices and resource allocation. So this seems like a problem that's maybe just too big for 2 men to take on, for a group of 15 or 20 students to take it on, but take it on they do. They develop new screening procedures to quickly identify and remove bad cases from the system. Last year, for example, the Justice Innovation Lab released the case for screening. In this report, they helped quantify the communal harm caused by the prevalence of cases with legally insufficient evidence. That is, cases that go to trial where there's not even enough proof. 1 in 4 cases were being dismissed because of problems that could be identified early. However, it took an average of over 220 days to identify and remove these cases from the system. Now, you might count those days by the calendar, or you might count them by the lives that were impacted adversely by this delay. So Justice Innovation Lab works with eliminating harms that are unnecessary to both victims and the accused by diverting resources away from cases that impact public safety in this system, or back towards cases that actually impact public safety. They also reduce racial disparities in traffic stops and searches. On September 8th, for example, 2021 in Ramsey County, Minnesota, the Attorney's Office announced that the office would decline to prosecute cases stemming from non-public safety traffic stops, that is, stops based solely on certain minor equipment or registration infractions. So I could go on, but what you see here is a combination of the Academy's intellectual resources, big data, being combined with one of the most pressing challenges of our time, mass incarceration, in order to teach students and to accomplish significant changes in policy, procedure, and law in order to save, improve, and protect the lives of people who are otherwise underrepresented and underpowered in our criminal justice system. So today's program celebrates the release of Jared's new book, Fire on the Levee. It's a scathing book about police brutality and failed injustice. Fire in the Levee tells a story behind the scenes of the mysterious murder and burning of Henry Glover, an unarmed black man who was killed by the New Orleans police in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. For years, his murder was covered up by the police department, and Jared led the investigation that resulted in the prosecution of 5 New Orleans Police Department officers. The case ultimately led to a major reform, or a series rather, of major reforms to the New Orleans Police Department and its procedure. I extend my deep gratitude to Jared and the rest of his amazing team of panelists who are with us here today. Roy Austin, Ashley Johnson, Christy Lopez, and Anthony Scott. You'll get further introductions. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished author, Jared Fishman. I'm puffing out my chest because he's my graduate. Jared Fishman is a GW Law alum, and while he was a student here, he was very active in clinical work. He studied law by doing, by working with real clients in their criminal appeals and in a lawsuit against the DC jail for illegally detaining people. After graduating, Jared worked with the United States Department of Justice. He spent that formative time in post-war Kosovo, then he spent formative time in post-war Kosovo, where he helped the justice system decision makers rebuild their legal system. Jared went on to become a senior prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where he led some of the most complex civil rights prosecutions in the country, securing convictions in high-profile cases, including misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. I'll tell you about one case in particular, not the one that's the subject of our book today, that had an influence on Jared's decision to become a prosecutor. One of the significant motivations behind not only his career choices, but also in founding Justice Innovation Lab was the case of the late Walter Scott, whose brother Anthony is on today's panel. In April of 2015, Walter Scott, a 50-year-old black man, was pulled over for a broken taillight in North Charleston, South Carolina. Less than 2 minutes later, he was gunned down by a police officer, despite the fact that he was unarmed and posed no risk to the officer. During the investigation into Walter Scott's death, Jared, who was then a senior prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice, teamed up with Charleston's chief prosecutor to secure justice in the case. After leaving the DOJ in 2020, he founded Justice Innovation Lab to address the structural inequalities that this case exposed in our justice system. Today, we're going to talk about another case that exposes similar inequalities, similar inequities, and similar racism. We're fortunate today to have a chance to work closely with Jared here at GW. It's my great pleasure to introduce him and his panel. Jared Fishman.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It's wonderful to be back at GW. First time I was in this room was about 20 years ago. At that time, it was the set for CNN's Crossfire. I don't know if anyone remembers that show. It was a talk show that featured a young Tucker Carlson as he faced off against Paul Begala, who then spent an entire hour yelling at each other in the most unproductive exchange known to humankind. And I wondered at that time, is this the future of discourse in America? It turned out that dialogue in America was going to be more dystopian than I even imagined. But I believe that we can and must do better, and my hope is that today we can have a different conversation. So I brought together a number of my good friends who I have worked with over the course of their careers who are dedicated to building a more just and fair system. And I'm excited to bring us all together for a great conversation today. Dana, thank you for your remarks. She is not only a visionary leader, but a wonderful human, and her leadership is pushing the boundaries of what is possible at the Academy for working on human rights and civil rights. Thank you for believing in me, for Justice Innovation Lab, and that the ability and the potential that we have to impact not only the lives of the students that we teach, but how we can profoundly change our criminal legal system and how it functions. Now, as Dana noted, my best moments in law school were working as a student lawyer in a GW legal clinics. I loved doing legal clinics. I took 3 of them because if I was going to pontificate on legal theory, at least I wanted to help someone along the way. 2 of my favorite professors are in the audience today, Ann Olson and Jenny Lyman, who created the most powerful learning experience that I ever had in law school, where I learned the practice of law while helping real people navigate their problems. It was here at GW that I learned not only what the law was, but I learned what it was not. And I learned that our legal system manifestly came up short. And when I went to GW Law, I really had no interest in being a real lawyer, and I certainly had no interest in being a prosecutor. I came to law school to learn how law and legal systems functioned so that we could prevent war, or at least rebuild after war. I spent the early parts of my career working in war zones in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in Rwanda. And my first job after law school was at the US State Department, where I was shipped out to Kosovo to help them rebuild their legal system. On one winter's day, I drove through the frozen Kosovo countryside with a colleague trying to figure out how we could change the system. And my senior colleague said to me, he said, "Kid," okay, he didn't actually say that, but the story works a little bit better. He says, "Kid," he says, "you're smart. I know you've got a quality education from George Washington University Law School, but," he says, "you haven't done anything yet. If you want to be effective, if you want to be successful out in the world, you need to experience the inside of the system first." He told me to go be a prosecutor. Now, I couldn't fathom being a prosecutor because I couldn't imagine a job whose end game was sending people to prison. So I looked at him and I said I cared too much about civil rights. I told him I wanted to be a defense attorney. And he looked at me and he said, "If you care about civil rights, then you definitely should be a prosecutor because they are the ones with all the power. Prosecutors' decisions have the power to impact who is arrested, what happens to them afterwards. In a single year, a prosecutor can impact the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of people." And so I took a job as a prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's office where, much to my surprise, I loved the job. And not only that, it turned out I was good at it. But the legal system that I confronted with the front row seat showed me just how broken America's justice system is. It was impossible not to notice that everyone in our system was black or brown. It was impossible not to notice how much poverty and marginalization was happening in our court systems. And so I figured if I was going to work inside this system, I wanted to work on behalf of those most marginalized positions by power. I wanted to do a different kind of prosecution. I wanted to prosecute the people who exploited and abused the most vulnerable people in our system. And so I became a prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where I investigated hate crimes, human trafficking, and police misconduct. Our job was to police the police. And I was about 2 years into my time at the Department of Justice when a thin brown folder landed on my desk. In that folder was only 2 items. One was the autopsy of a man named Henry Glover, whose charred remains were found in a car burned out behind a levee in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The second was an article from A.C. Thompson, who, unfortunately, due to some family emergency, was not able to make it today. But the work that A.C. had done was critical. He had been looking at deaths in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and he was drawn to one particular death, the death of Henry Glover. And through his research, he tried to map out what happened on Henry's last day. And what he found was that the last people known to have seen Henry were the New Orleans Police Department. He suggested that if we were ever to find out what happened to Henry Glover, we needed to investigate the police. And so a much younger Jared Fishman was sent down to New Orleans, where he was teamed up with a rookie FBI agent, Special Agent Ashley Johnson. For 17 months, we investigated what happened. We interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, including police officers. We ran down countless dead ends. But in the end, 5 police officers were indicted for killing Henry, burning his body, and for the extensive cover-up that followed. I write about it in my book, Fire on the Levee, which recently was published and is the impetus for today's gathering. Now, I often get asked, why are you writing about a case that happened almost 20 years ago? Why now, and why does it still matter? I handled many cases over the course of my career that exposed me to disturbing conduct where people did terrible things to other people. But this case in particular stayed with me. Part of it is just how shocking the allegations were, that in America, an American citizen could be murdered and burned, and that could be hidden and covered up for 3.5 years. Part of it was the setting, the dystopian hellscape of a society on the brink of collapse in the aftermath of a storm of unprecedented proportions. Part of it was the involvement of a police force notorious as one of the most corrupt and abusive in the United States. And yet, at the same time, this case bore so much in common with the scores of other police abuse cases that I investigated over the course of my career. Deep in this story, we see the dehumanization of marginalized communities. We see us versus them cultures that pit the police against the communities they're sworn to serve. But one thing that really struck with me was how many people inside our system saw wrongdoing and did nothing about it, or lied about it, or helped cover up for it. But this case is also about the people who stood up against injustice, even though it was hard, even though they feared for their lives. It's about a community that began to say, this is not who we are, and we can do better. And it's about the efforts of countless people, some of whom are here with us today, who began figuring out how we could build that better system, how we could do things different. When I was figuring out how I wanted to celebrate the launch of the book, I thought, why don't I bring some of the people together who were a part of this journey with me to discuss not only what this case meant to them, but how it shaped them into the powerful advocates that they became. And more importantly, how can we learn from the past so that we can build a more just and equitable future? So I'd like to invite up Jarvis Edo, Justice Innovation Lab's Director of Prosecution Programs and Partnership, to introduce our panelists today. Jarvis is a good friend, former prosecutor, brilliant innovator, adult educator, who is helping us figure out how do we take the lessons that we learn from big data and make it actionable so that we don't just talk about legal theories and philosophy, but we can actually begin to change our system and build the future that we want. Jarvis?
Jared? So it's an honor to be leading this discussion today, and in a moment I'm going to ask all of the panelists to share a little bit, like you did, Jared, about who you were in 2009 when you came to this case, but I'd like to introduce you sort of in the context of the Glover case before I do that. So As Jared mentioned, this case started with an article that was drafted by A.C. Thompson, who can't be here with us tonight or this afternoon. But that article was inspired by a man named William Tanner. And William Tanner was dogged in getting attention to the Glover case. William Tanner not only inspired the article that A.C. Thompson wrote, but he also pursued Ashley Johnson, who at the time I believe was a rookie agent taking complaints at the field office. Ashley, who we are very lucky to have with us today, went on to lead FBI field offices in Atlanta and Chicago, where I believe she focused on crimes against children and human trafficking issues. She's an advisor to the FBI director and now leads the Internal Operations Division at the FBI. So thank you for joining us, Ashley. As Jared mentioned, 17 months later, hundreds of interviews after this case arrives on your desk, the new mayor in New Orleans, I think rightfully starts to sense that there's a pattern of abuses that is sort of emerging in the aftermath of Katrina with the New Orleans Police Department. Allegations that were incredibly shocking and so shocking that the mayor invited the Justice Department in to investigate that misconduct. And it was at that time that Roy Austin, who we are very lucky to have with us today, was the second in command in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice and was responsible for leading that broader investigation into those practices at NOPD. Roy went on to the White House, where he served as Domestic Policy Counsel to the President for Urban Affairs, Justice and Opportunity. He served on the Biden and Harris transition team and is currently the Vice President of Civil Rights at Meta. Very lucky to have him as well. That investigation into NOPD misconduct was led by Christy Lopez. She was on the ground and conducted what I believe was one of the most extensive investigations into a police department that has ever taken place. They looked at everything from use of force to training and staffing issues. We are very lucky to have Christy with us here today. I hope we'll have time to get into this in a bit. But the investigation that she led resulted in a number of reforms in that department. And yeah, thank you for joining us. And then finally, sorry, forgive me. Many years after this case, Jared found himself working on another very similar case that the dean mentioned in North Carolina. It was working on the Walter Scott case that Jared developed a relationship with Anthony, who has joined us here today. Anthony has been a trusted advisor to Jared and to Justice Innovation Lab for a long time. He is a community leader and was catapulted, unfortunately, I think, into the spotlight. And in the aftermath of his brother's death, I think you cannot overstate how critical his voice was in avoiding, I think, some of the turmoil that we saw in Ferguson and LA. We are very lucky to have you with us today. Thank you for coming,
Thank
Anthony.
you.
And so I would love to just turn it over to the panelists. We're going to keep this somewhat conversational, but I'd like, as Jared did, for each of you to reflect a little bit on who you were in 2009 when you came to this case. Philosophically, professionally, who were you when you saw that manila folder? And I'd love to start with you, Ashley.
Thank you. So I graduated the academy, I'll start there, in April of 2008. So in 2009, when I received this case, I had only been an FBI agent for about 9 months at that time, because I believe we got it in January of 2009. But prior to that, what kind of led me to that point, my first job out of college, I had a criminal justice degree. My first job, I was a caseworker at what we call drug court, a probationary diversionary program. And I remember, at the time I was about 21, 22 years old, and I remember the defendants would be in court and they would have to plead guilty to whatever their charge was. And before they would plead guilty, the prosecutor would have to read what the charges were and the circumstances surrounding the arrest. And I remember one day in particular, they're reading, his name was Reginald, and they're reading the charges against him. And they describe it as Reginald is walking out of a Exxon gas station. The police think he's suspicious, so they search him. And they find marijuana in his pocket. And at the time, marijuana was illegal, so you got arrested for it. And I remember sitting there thinking, but what gave them the right to search him? And I remember thinking, I'm the youngest in the room. I just graduated, never been to law school, but I'm questioning his defense attorney, and I'm questioning, why is the judge accepting his plea? And I remember that stuck with me. And it was the first time that, of course, I'd heard about it, but I had actually witnessed what I believed to be an injustice. And I think that was kind of the catalyst to my career following that and my educational decisions. I later became a social worker, so I was a social worker immediately prior to joining the FBI. So in 2000, by the time I got to the FBI in 2008, and this case in 2009, I was 31 years old at that time. I had a small child, so by that time she was 11 years old. So I was a mother. I was a new agent trying to find my way, trying to understand, take all that training that you get, put it to use, but understanding what I wanted my role to be just from my experience from a social standpoint, as well as what my responsibilities were. When I got to New Orleans, I was originally assigned to work healthcare fraud. So it's not as not as exciting. You go through medical records all the time, you're looking for fraud, but it was my job and it's what I was assigned to do, and I was happy to do it. I was very honored to be an agent, but I always knew that I wanted to work civil rights. It was what really drove me to join the FBI. The fact that the FBI is the only investigative body responsible for the investigation of civil rights at the federal level. And there was an agent on my squad who that was his assigned violation, and he would allow me to come out on investigations with him. And pretty soon I began to, become good at the job, understand what was required for the violation, conduct the interviews and so forth. And so when William Tanner came in and he communicated what his allegation was, my supervisor said, Ashley, do you want to take this lead, or do you want to take this complaint? And from there, William Tanner told his story, and here we are.
Thank you. Let me just move down the line, I think in chronological order maybe. So, Roy, would you mind just sharing who you were in 2009?
So first of all, thank you, Jared. The book's amazing. The book tells a story that many of us there are a few of us in this room who were in the criminal section, who we understand what you're talking about in so many ways, though obviously this is a unique case because I never had a body that was burned. I never had quite the insanity that you dealt with. So 2009, I actually was a line attorney in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division starting in 1995, and had an experience very similar to Jared's, where my law school career, I actually knew I wanted to be a trial attorney, but I also knew I wanted to be a public defender, and there was no way I would ever prosecute a case. And then in law school, I got a chance to be a summer at the criminal section. And then when I got the job, a person by the name of Ricky Roberts, who is actually here today, who was the chief of the section, he said, go over to the DC U.S. Attorney's office and learn how to try a case. I'm like, well, that's the last thing I want to do is go lock up black and brown kids or prosecute them. But I went there and I fell in love with it and ended up in the criminal section for about 5 years. Then I went off to a law firm, And then I came back and was an AUSA in DC because I actually loved prosecution. I loved the idea that as a prosecutor, you really could seek justice. You were, in many cases, the most powerful person in the justice system, deciding exactly, as you said, Jared, who you were going to investigate, what sentences you were going to seek, whether to believe the law enforcement officers who were coming before you. And then I'd left again. You'll note that my leaving the Department of Justice was related to the birth of my children, as I was told that, you got to feed these kids at the same time that you were doing this work. And so 2008 is when President Obama was elected, and I had actually had him as a professor in law school, and very badly wanted to get back into the Department of Justice from the law firm. And so my first step was returning to the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. I was there doing civil rights cases for DC, along with human trafficking cases. And then January of 2010, late 2009, January of 2010, I returned to the Department of Justice as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. I was not the second in charge. I was a group of folks who supported then Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez. But I had the portfolio that involved supervising the work of the criminal section and supervising the work of the special litigation section's criminal justice portfolio. And then I'll help you with your lead-in, because I get there in January 2010. New Orleans is a cesspool. Tom Perez and I are sitting here going, who is going to help us investigate the New Orleans Police Department? And we both said, Christy Lopez is the best possible person that we can bring in. And I spent countless hours on the phone begging her to come back to the Department of Justice, and she'll tell you more about her path, because she was that good. And this was going to be the biggest case that the Special Litigation Section had ever done. And so, just to help you with your transition.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
It's a good transition, but I'm not sure how true it is. I think I was the only one that answered the phone. But, yeah, so in 2009, I had just quit as the monitor of the Oakland Police Department, the court-appointed monitor of the Oakland Police Department. Being a monitor of a police department is a thankless job, and it's an exhausting job. And it's also a job, I think, that it's harmful to the process for a single person, for the same person to do for too long. So I decided to leave that position. I'd been at the Department of Justice prior in the Civil Rights Division. Roy and I started in 1995 together, but I was in the Special Litigation Section, which investigates, conducts pattern or practice investigations of prisons and jails and also of police departments. I had left there. I had become a monitor of the Oakland Police Department, and I decided in the spring of 2010 that I was going to leave that. I had left that job, and I was going to spend the summer writing about garrity, which is a ridiculous area of law that the courts get wrong and that police departments get wrong, and it really messes up police accountability. There's lots more I could say about that, but I won't. And that was my plan. And then Tom Perez called, and I knew Tom from my prior work at DOJ, and also because we were on the board of a group called CASA in Maryland that works for immigrant rights, and we'd done a lot of work together. And he said, do you want to come back to DOJ? And I was like, no. And he said, do you want to come back to DOJ and investigate the New Orleans Police Department? And I said, oh, yes, I very much do. And that's when Roy started calling me and talking about not only did we need to investigate the New Orleans Police Department, but we actually needed to help revive the pattern or practice police misconduct statute, which had been a bit moribund during the Bush administration. And so between those two things, I really was something that I could not refuse, even though I had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old at home at the time, and I really was looking forward to spending some more time with them, but that was not to be, at least not for a little while. But the reason why is that when I had been at DOJ the first time, we had opened up an investigation of the New Orleans Police Department. We investigated the New Orleans Police Department for a pattern or practice of misconduct in the late 90s. And our attorney, Robert Musi, was the lead line attorney on that. He was down there in the offices of Mary Howell, the iconic civil rights attorney who is mentioned many times in this book. And he was called back to DC for, long story short, political reasons. And it was infuriating to me. And then when Katrina hit, and I don't know, I've said many times that to fix a police department, you have to fix the city. And the upside of that is that when you've sort of made a police department a little better, you've tended to make the city a little bit better. So when Katrina happened, before we heard about all the police abuse, we heard about the police absence, the lack of police protection, the hundreds of officers who just left, right? Many, many heroic police officers did many, many heroic things during that time period. But the overall story was one of a failure of its police department to protect, and the failure of its city to protect its individuals, the poorest, most vulnerable individuals in that city. And I felt sort of vicariously guilty. I wondered whether if we had stayed the course before Katrina and had done a better job in New Orleans, maybe history could be different, and that entire tragedy could have been much less tragic. So I was very motivated when Tom called and when Roy began to harangue me to return to DOJ and begin this investigation.
Thank you. So I want to shift just to asking, I would love everyone's perspective on this, but I really want to know what stuck with you most about this case in particular. And I think it makes sense to start with you, Ashley, and then maybe I'll move to you, Jared. Like what stuck with you? What, yeah, I mean, something that has sort of shaped your perception of the work going forward.
I think the thing that has most stuck with me is the power and a large number of our population that feels unheard, and they've kind of resolved themselves to being unheard. And I saw that both on the police side with police officers as well as with the family. I remember Jared and I were on an interview at Ms. Glover's house, Henry's mother, and her son Edward, who's one of the witnesses and talks about it in the book, he was sitting in a chair to the corner, and Ms. Glover was kind of sitting where you are, and I was talking to her, but I could feel Edward kind of just looking at me, kind of with a glare almost. And so I didn't know, was he happy I was there? Was he upset? Was he angry? So I asked him, I said, you know, Edward, what's wrong? And he kind of looked at me and he said, I can't believe you're here. And I said, what do you mean you can't believe I'm here? And his exact words were, nobody cares about people like us. This has been happening to us for years. And it was at that moment I kind of realized maybe, and thought to myself, maybe I had gone through life a little naive. Like, although I had been a probation officer, I had been a social worker, so I had seen marginalized communities. I had marginalized people within my family. But I had never heard anyone speak those words, because I have a younger brother, and I just thought about that. Like, there's no way I could feel my brother was a victim of being shot, and then later being burned, and then by the police, and I would think that I would sit quietly, or that my parents would sit quietly. It just didn't seem normal to me, but for him, it was normal. So from a community standpoint, that stuck with me. And then some of the officers, particularly the three officers who were kind of the heroes to me within this case, Panelists, Linda Howard, and Kiala Bell, all Black women on the New Orleans Police Department who knew their jobs, who were very smart, who had risen through the ranks. Kiala was a rookie at the time, but you had three women who knew what they knew and knew what had happened, but they were told that's not what happened, and they kind of resolved to that. So those two things, different aspects of it, different players within the story, but it was the same song almost. They were singing the same verses as to, they just resolved to the fact that they weren't justified in their beliefs. They weren't justified in what they had observed, and it was better to just be quiet about it. And for a long time that it bothered me, but then it began to inspire me, because I realized, you know, they were looking at me. The Glover family was looking at me. I felt that some of the police officers, particularly those young women, were kind of looking not to me just so much as an FBI agent, but they identified or believed they identified with me. So I felt kind of protective, or that I needed to protect that. And so for me, that's what stuck with me through the case, is that the importance of believing people, and also where you can be an advocate to be an advocate.
Yeah, I mean, that the resignation or I should say, like the doubt, right, of like, is what I'm seeing real? Does it matter? Will people care?
And the numbness. You're just numb to it at this point.
Definitely.
Even if
resonates.
it's your brother.
And I can't help but want your perspective on that, Anthony. But I would love, just real quick, to go to you, Jared, and hear you riff a little bit on what stuck with you.
Yeah, I think the thing that really surprised me was how many people knew about this and how hard it was for Ashley and I to figure that out. I mean, we talked to hundreds of people. In the first draft of the manuscript, it's actually 200 pages longer, and my publisher said, "No, you need to cut this down." And basically, I got rid of 200 pages of persistence of Ashley and I getting lied to, because I was told that readers wouldn't be as patient as Ashley and I were, which I think is true. And I look back and think, wow, that really took persistence. But the number of people who saw it and didn't tell us in 2009, didn't tell us in 2010, didn't tell us in 2013. If you buy the book and you make it all the way to the epilogue, you'll see that even in 2022, we were still learning new information that had been withheld all of these years. It blew me away that people in a position of authority, people who had sworn to uphold the law, people who had committed to finding justice, could see this particular injustice, which was one of the most extreme that I have ever seen, and could be silent about it, and just how hard it was for people who I believed to be good people to speak up and to step out. And I think over time, what really stuck to me, and a lot of times when we're in the justice system, we talk about good guys and bad guys. We want to get the bad guys, we want to help the good guys. But what I think this case really helped me realize is that there is context, and people do a lot of bad things depending on that context. And what we need to do to build better systems is to create context where it is easier to do the right thing, where it is impossible for injustice like this to fester.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, and I know Christy and Roy, your vantage point was much higher up, and you had a number of cases you were looking at. But if there was anything that stuck with you about the Glover case in particular.
Oh, I think, yes. I mean, I remember the Glover case was sort of on a parallel track. We were not supposed to be, involved with it all. So it was certainly in my mind. But two things I think that reading this book reminded me of. One is that the First Amendment is the best amendment. AC is testament to that. The fact that he is the one putting that, writing that article in The Nation is what got this case started, and what made it impossible for people to ignore, and just when it got too difficult to, just pretend like that didn't happen. And that has been my experience throughout this work. And it's been the history of police reform, right? When Mr. Holloway took the video of Rodney King being beaten and tried to give it to LAPD, and they wouldn't take it, so he took it to the local news station, right? The press has always been, a free press has always been a very key part of this work. And so I think that was one of the things that's always struck me about this case, and so many of the other atrocities that happened in New Orleans and in so much of policing. The other thing, and it relates to what Jared said, is how much work it takes to investigate and try to reform a police department from a pattern or practice perspective, but how much of a difference it can make. And what I mean by that is I was really surprised when I read the part in the book where when Henry Glover's family and the Good Samaritan Tanner bring him to this police station, this sort of de facto police station, trying to get him help. Instead, they get beaten, and Henry is allowed to die, and his body is burned. There were, I think, 50 people, you estimate, were there that saw this. 50 officers, and then they proceeded to lie for years. And that is a scary, scary prospect. It's far worse than the mafia, right? Because it's like the mafia with like state power and the power to use violence. Then let's go forward a few years, many years, to I think 2019, and Arlinda Westbrook, who's the civilian head of the Internal Affairs Bureau in New Orleans, very different than the Internal Affairs Bureau you all dealt with, she tells me a story, and it wasn't until reading this book that I really felt the importance of this story. She tells me a story that was caught on body cam of a car chase through New Orleans. I think it was on the Highway 10, on the outskirts of New Orleans, and it was either Jefferson Parish or Louisiana State Police, could have been either one, were pursuing a vehicle along with New Orleans. They finally, they stop the vehicle, they bring the person out, the person's in handcuffs, and either the Jefferson Parish or the Louisiana State Police person starts beating them. And on body cam, you can see this, one of the NOPD officers reaches over and grabs him away and says, "We don't roll like that anymore." Right? And when you think about the difference between what happened when Mr. Tanner and Glover's family brought him to that substation and what happened on that highway, there's a lot of work to be done in policing, and a lot of perfectly lawful policing is very harmful, but that is a difference, and it's a difference that matters. And I think it really, for me, that's what stuck with me about this case, that you can take a department that is that broken, and you can change the culture enough so that kind of thing doesn't happen.
I would like to say something about the book that stuck out to me about the book the most was when Patrice was in court, and Patrice had to testify for her brother. And in doing that, it put me in a place where I was there, her being the victim. And being the victim, you look at it a totally different way because it's your brother and you want the best for him. And you can see in the book where she expressed how she loved him. She even saw him get shot. And that's so painful and such a hard thing to do. But another thing that stuck out to me was Ashley and Jared's pursuit for justice. They had nothing to work with. They were investigative reporters. They just went out there and took nothing and made something. And that takes a drive. In my case, when Jared handled my case, he had everything he needed. But to do something like that takes two special people.
Thank
you. There are a bunch of things and a bunch of words that come to mind just reading this book and just reliving so much of what happened, because I had both the criminal perspective and the civil perspective as we were looking at New Orleans, and so was very familiar with what was happening in the Glover case while we were more broadly looking at a lot of the civil stuff. Look, it's the corruption. It's the humanity and lack thereof over and over again by so many people who were involved in this. I mean, he just didn't matter to so many people, or they were able to create in their minds that he was just a looter. His life wasn't valuable enough to try to save, to not shoot, and just what we saw coming out of Katrina was just, us versus them is one way to put it, but it was, these people don't matter. And the whole idea of policing is to protect and serve and be a part of your community. And they had given up on their community. And so how can you expect anything to happen there? And then just the sheer corruption. It's the lying. You mentioned the details, and we had so much fun, I will say, with the details. So the detail is the moonlighting system in New Orleans. And I remember the best conversation I had on that was we actually convinced them while we were in the middle of our investigation to end the cash payment of police officers in New Orleans. Because in New Orleans, the officers would go to the CVS and say, "Hey, you need protection, don't you?" And the person said, "Well, I'm not sure I do that." "Yeah, you need protection, don't you? And you will be paying me in cash." And you're like, what police officer actually accepts cash for payment? And so we convinced the chief to end this, and he really pushed back hard at the time. He's like, "I can't end this. This is who we are. This is the culture of New Orleans policing." And went back a few months later and said, "How's that going? The banning on this these payment system?" He said, "Well, they no longer accept cash, but they ask for checks made out to cash." But it's the depth of the corruption. It's the whole idea that many of you have heard, the cliche that culture eats policy for lunch or for breakfast or for dinner, for all meals, really, at the end of the day. Because the New Orleans Police Department, exactly what Christy was talking about, it had been investigated before. People knew it was awful. People knew it was corrupt, and allowed that to happen and just keep going. But for the work that Jared did and Bobby Bernstein did and other people in the criminal section, the work that Christy did and Jonathan Smith, who was her direct supervisor at the time, it would have been allowed to keep going. And now we're seeing that the backlash to the backlash that we kind of worked on, and that was trying to fix policing, which is a job that still needs to be done very badly.
I thought you were going to give me the transition again. I thought
She went first, that's what, so I couldn't.
No, I do want to ask you, Christy, that a number of folks have talked about what it takes to investigate this kind of crime and pursue it. And I know that I forgot to mention this when I was introducing you, but I know that a lot of your work now is specifically around working with departments around bystander intervention. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that in the context of this question, which is like, how do you think about solutions today, given that experience?
Sure. At first, I should say, I was remiss not to say at the beginning that these investigations take an entire team of people, and if I led the team, it just meant that Roy yelled at me first. But it was, we had a great team of people working on this, attorneys and investigators from the special litigation section, and maybe 7 or 8 people, and which sounds like a lot, but when you are trying to establish a pattern of hundreds of cases with a lot of people who don't want to talk to you, it takes a lot. So it was quite an intensive investigation that took about 10 months, but it really was a lot of really dedicated individuals doing that work. One of the great things about this work is the individuals you meet in communities that have been working on these issues for so long, and they are so happy to see you there, and knowing that you can bring some resources and some attention to an issue that they've cared about for so long. And one of those individuals in New Orleans is Mary Howell, and one of the things that she's a civil rights attorney, she's been there forever, working on these issues, and one of the things that she did when I first got there was start sending me mimeographed copies of a book of a man named Irvin Staub, who was a Holocaust survivor, who had dedicated his life to trying to figure out why people see other people do terrible things and don't intervene to stop them from doing harm. And he had tried to get the LAPD interested in this sort of bystander intervention idea, and they hadn't gone for it. And so she really wanted me to understand this and to make NOPD have a bystandership program, which had never been done in a police department, and we're not really, it's difficult to get something like that into a consent decree. So what we did in the consent decree here was we called it peer intervention, and we sprinkled it around a few places in the consent decree. It's sort of, something that if people wanted to, they could use it as a hook, but we knew we were not going to be able to force anybody to adopt this sort of program. To their credit, and to the credit of the monitor, the court-appointed monitor, Jonathan Arney, they saw that. They asked Mary and I what the language was about. We told them, and they thought it was a great idea. And the idea is that we know that people think that they should intervene, and many people think that they would intervene if they saw something terrible happening, but we don't realize how often we wouldn't intervene. And what Irvin Staub, what his work had determined, is that you can actually teach people to intervene when they otherwise wouldn't have, and to be more effective in their intervention so that it actually works. And so we wanted to adapt these ideas to policing. It doesn't work, to be fair, unless you have a culture and a leadership that supports it, but that can be an iterative process, right? And so we did that, they did that in New Orleans. It was called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous. They developed this program, and it seemed to be having a big impact in NOPD. The problem was there were 492 paragraphs, and so it was hard to tell which of those 400 of the consent decree, and so it was hard to tell which of those 492 things were making the difference. But, so we couldn't really study it to know for sure. Then, and a lot of departments, when we would say, hey, this is a really promising program, you should consider it, they would say, oh, we already do that, we're good, we have a policy on duty to intervene. And then when George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020, and everyone saw those 3 officers standing there, not intervening, thanks to Darnella Fraser's amazing documentary work there, we saw people could see for themselves. you're not intervening. You could have made a huge difference if you would have intervened. How do we get officers to intervene? Jonathan Aaron and I saw that as an opportunity, and so we leapt in and we kind of redid the pedagogy of the program, brought in we have an amazing team working on this. We renamed it ABLE, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, and now the center that I co-direct at Georgetown, the Center for Innovations in Community Safety, one of our projects is training departments in this active bystandership for law enforcement, and we're able to research it now and study it and hopefully figure out when it has an impact, when it doesn't, and how to really help it. We really want it to be a part of changing the culture of how police officers think about their work and think about policing.
Thank you. I'm curious, other folks, how you think about solutions.
So from a law enforcement standpoint, when I'm training new agents or agents are assigned to me, specifically when I managed a squad, it's kind of like, I would liken it to old-fashioned policing. Like, you need to talk to people. You can't make assumptions about information. A solution is, your job is to vet leads. Your job is to collect facts and determine whether or not if they fit into a bucket of a federal crime or not. But you cannot make it subjective, where you look at something and then you make an opinion just based on your own assumption. You have to do the work. As Jared said, we did literally, I think there were about 350 documents plus at the end written documents. This is the day when you had to type them out, you know. And so there was a lot of work that went into that. There was a lot of times when you didn't think the case was going to go forward. I didn't think the case may not go forward because of the lack of evidence, but it was a commitment to what I had sworn to do, and a commitment to not just the Glover family, but the community of New Orleans and America and American people as a whole. So that's what I found as a solution, that making sure that the next group of agents or the next collection of law enforcement officers have the skill set, that basic skill set that requires them to interact with people, that requires them to talk to people and to trust people. And you have to trust that information regardless if you have a personal experience with it or not.
I'm curious, just to follow up on something you mentioned earlier. You noted that the three witnesses in this case that you named were all Black women. To what extent do you feel like that, you know, in terms of training and your ability to think about solutions going forward, to like how do you account for that in what you described? Does that make sense? So in the sense that, like, so you mentioned that, how do I put this? I have to imagine that there are some things that you can train and there are some things perhaps that you can't. And I wonder if you had that sense when, in the work that you're currently doing.
And you're right, there's some things you can train. You can teach people how to conduct interviews. You can teach people how to collect evidence, how to enter evidence, those type of things, but you can't always teach empathy or sympathy. And I think a lot of times that is missing, specifically out of law enforcement officers. There's a projection that you sometimes think you have to get forth. And as a female agent, there are only 150 at this time, 158 Black women in the FBI out of 14,000 agents. And then you take it down even smaller from that. I'm only one of 3 Black females that's an executive. So when I talked about sometimes feeling voiceless, it's not that you don't feel what you have to say is valuable. It's not. But it is a matter of you're in a room and you don't know how it's going to be received. So I think those things aren't teachable. They're things you have to kind of come to terms with yourself. You know, if I'm going to be in this position, if I'm going to be at this table, I need to take advantage of it. So I think the drive, the persistence, I don't think that's teachable necessarily. You can give people the skill set of how to pursue information, but to be told no repeatedly and get back up. And sometimes by your peers, sometimes by your management, may not have faith in what you're doing or faith in the ability that this can go forward. I think it's something that is kind of intuitive, and it needs to be sought after when we're recruiting law enforcement officers, prosecutors, or whatever the case may be.
Makes sense. Thank you. And I definitely want to get your perspective too, Jared. Jared is a solutions person for folks who don't know him.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, one of the things that I have really appreciated, and you know, for me, for many years, the Glover case was probably one of my biggest disappointments of any cases that I'd ever worked on. There was so much injustice. But when I step back with all of these years later and you look at the change of culture in police department, it was a part of this change of calling out injustice and knowing that we can, in fact, change and move cultures. And the question is how to do it. I mean, I think, Anthony, the work that you're doing in North Charleston blows my mind. I'll let you talk about what you've been doing with the police department, but Anthony has been training hundreds of police officers at the North Charleston Police Department, the very police department that killed his brother. And there is no doubt that the work that you're doing with the police department there is making that a better place.
Well, in 2019, 2018 actually, I saw the chief of police walking the streets of North Charleston on a one-man protest for people getting murdered in his city. And he was walking the streets and saying that he needs to get justice and need people to join him. And I saw that and I was sitting there and I'm like, wow, that's incredible for the chief to have a one-man protest by himself. So I saw him, I gave him a call. They were having a Turkey Day giveaway. So I gave him a call. I said, I'd like to join you in that and help you with that. So I gave him a call. He said, oh, we would love to have you. I got out there that day, and when I got there, the police chief actually gave me and my wife a hug, and he broke down crying. And he said, I've been wanting to reach out to you guys forever, but I just didn't know how to because I thought you were so angry with the police department. I said, I actually was. But when I saw you interacting with the city and wanted to make a change, I said, this is something I want to join in and help with, because I had a lot of personal issues with myself, suffering from the grief that I was dealing with that needed healing. And I said, there's no better way to get this healing by reaching out and helping. After I participated with that day, he said, I want you to talk to each police new recruits that we have. I said, it would be my pleasure. He said, I want you to share your story with these new recruits of how this affected your family. And I said, I would love to do that. And in the beginning, it was very tough because I had a lot of PTSD suffering from the case, our current case. And eventually, I got the willpower. I said, you know what, I'm built for this. And I got in there and started talking to the recruits. And over the course of since 19 until this day, I've spoken to about 140 new recruits, almost the quota that they needed in new recruits because they had a great falling out of police officers after my brother's case, because they didn't like how that took place, how it went down, and things were changing. The dynamics at the police department was changing. But I figured that I could help with the inside and change the culture of policing than working from the outside and just being a protester. So that's what I tried to do, and that's what we're doing in Charleston. Thank you.
Thank you. I kind of connected to that, and I'll put this to you, Jared. I want to hear you riff a little bit about how your work on this case influenced how you think about solutions, but perhaps you can do that in the context, just for time's sake, of data, right? JIL is an organization, as the Dean and Jared mentioned, that's really focused on using data to inform decision-making in the criminal justice context. So we'd love to hear you talk a little bit about
Yeah, I mean, I think it started, I was standing on the courthouse steps with Anthony Scott, and it was clearly the biggest victory of my career. We had successfully prosecuted a Charleston Police Department. He was sentenced to 20 years of incarceration. The court called the death of your brother what it was, which was a murder. And it was undoubtedly a huge victory. But having done this for 14 years, having lived through the Glover case, having lived through all these other cases, I remember just sitting there and feeling empty. I remember thinking there, like, this might feel good today, but what's going to happen tomorrow? And I knew that in the 2.5 years that we had spent investigating Walter's death, over 2,500 other people had been killed in confrontations by the police. And I knew that the next day, no matter what was going to happen, was the policies, procedures, systems, cultures, all of those things that led to his death were still going to be in place. And I think that was the point I decided, all right, I've got to do something different. I want to work to take on the system. And the state prosecutor, Scarlett Wilson, and I had many conversations about what was happening in Charleston and a lot of the legacy of racism and a lot of how deeply ingrained some of these systems were. And she said to me, I've been collecting data for a really long time, and I'd like to know, are we being fair? Are we contributing to these problems? But I don't have the capacity to figure it out. I don't know whether or not, I don't know anything about numbers. And she said, what do you think? And I said, I don't know if this will work either, but let's give it a try. And I reached out to my alma mater, and I got connected with Don Brayman, and he says, this is a great idea. Let's do it. And so we put together an amazing team at Justice Innovation Lab, led by Rory Polvino, Jess Sorensen, a number of other great folks who unfortunately are not with us today. But we began to use the number, and I didn't know much about data, but what I came to learn is it's really not that complicated. All data is counting. And all that really matters is that we start counting the right things. And in criminal justice and in law enforcement, for a long time, the only way we could count justice was to talk about the number of years people were incarcerated. And to me, that was a wholly insufficient way to figure out whether or not we were being just and fair. And so we put together a team, and we brought in prosecutors like Jarvis, and we began to meet that office where it was at and ask them, what do you want to do? Why are you in law enforcement? Why did you become prosecutors? And every single person we talked to says, I want to keep my community safe, but I want to do it in a fair way. And we said, great, well, what should we count? And so we began to use their data, looking at decision points that they made to count, are you doing things fair? And we found all sorts of disparities, and some of them could be explained by racial bias, but a lot of them couldn't. A lot of those disparities were being generated just by the very way the system functioned. And what was really remarkable to me is we met there and we began to meet people where they were at and to begin to ask questions and to begin to think about the system in a different way and to use numbers to start to quantify different things, is that we actually began to see that culture change. And we began to see them say, no, these outcomes, these are not who we want to be. Help us figure out how to do it. Help us understand where our system is failing. And this is in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a Republican-run district attorney's office. It is conservative southeastern America. And the fact that we were able to use numbers and to use our approach to move them forward made me think if we could do it there, we could do it anywhere.
Yeah.
Agreed.
No, please. Retweet. I think we'd be remiss not to hear your perspective, Roy, on the way that data can sort of shape decision-making around this stuff.
Look, criminal justice data sucks. I mean, there's no other term for it. It took, Christy was talking about, the First Amendment in newspapers. It took the Washington Post and the Guardian to actually do the research to dig in to realize that we have about 1,000 police-involved killings every single year, and it's been that way for at least probably the last 10 years. The numbers coming out of the FBI, I apologize, Ashley, but the numbers coming out of the FBI for all those years were like 200. And it took a newspaper to go in and look at it. The numbers, how we count crime, how we count drug usage, how we count everything is horrible. It really is. Hate crimes, one of the big things that we did at the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. I want to say, what was it? Mississippi, like 3 years ago, had 2 hate crimes. Alabama had 1. California had 300. Yet those are the numbers that we actually publish. We put those out there and say, these are our official numbers on hate crimes. The numbers in criminal justice, and what a lot of this is the power of police. Because they refuse to take any accountability for providing good data and good numbers. So it's so important that you have a police chief willing to hand over data and work with that data. And now that data in my current position, working for a tech company, that data is what's informing our artificial intelligence that's going to make decisions for us in the future. So you put in crappy data to make decisions that are going to take away people's justice, people's ability to live, people's safety, it's insane, and we're still doing that with our data. There have been many efforts to try to get law enforcement to get better data. We think public safety is our most important thing, yet our labor data is significantly better than our criminal justice data. Our fantasy football data is better than our criminal justice data. I mean, it is the worst data that we have, and yet we claim that we care about safety and safety and people's well-being. So we have a lot of work to continue to do there. It's taking work like what JIL is doing. It's taking work like when Able does more research and we dig in more deeply into actually what the impact is. But data matters, but for criminal justice, we're just not even there yet.
You already started to answer it a bit, but I was going to ask you, because that's very dismal and terrifying. But what gives you hope? And I think you started to answer, but then I'd love to hear other folks too.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not the most optimistic person on this stage, I suspect. You just keep seeing. I mean, again, we were making so much progress coming out with the work we were doing on consent decrees, and it took an election to totally turn that on its head and have the nonsense that you hear. Well, these consent decrees aren't really helping anyone, and they're not important, and it was just so much work. And luckily, we had great judges who insisted on carrying through with the work that we were doing there. I mean, right now we're having silly arguments. It's raised in the book, fines and fees. I mean, how are we incarcerating people who can't pay fines and fees? But that's who we are, and it's a stupid discussion. The length of prison sentences. We know for a fact that the length of prison sentences is too much for most of the crimes that we have. These small scale crimes that we're locking people up for. The disparities in black and brown people being locked up for the same crimes. I just, right now, I'm seeing this push and pull between utter nonsense and the reality of a gun violence. I mean, you could have all these arguments you want to, but if you don't have the gun, you're not going to be killing as many people as you're killing. We are in this country in the middle of these arguments that I honestly don't see how we get out of until we have some courageous people who simply ignore party, ignore partisanship, and actually start telling the truth. And I just don't see when that's going to happen. And I fear that it's really not getting any better. We're heading into another presidential election season where where the truth is just not going to be a part of the conversation.
The question was, what gives you hope?
I was
We're
going
going to
to
bring it back, Roy.
Hope. Yeah. So read Jared's book. That'll give you some hope. All right, read that book.
Yeah, other folks who perhaps have a bit more hope.
I'd like to say something here. What gives me hope is a program like JIL, and being started in a city like North Charleston or Charleston. It brought a light on the DA attorney, the system, so that they can take a look at the people that they're incarcerating, and they can look at the disparity that's actually there. And they could say that the same person or white person did this crime, a black person did this crime. In some cases, there's equal there, they get equal sentences, but a lot of times they don't. And a lot of times the black gentleman may take a plea, not even taking it to trial because they can't afford to get out on bond. As this white gentleman can get out and have an attorney, and it's a difference. So the bond system, and they were bringing to light these things, and although I did have a little pushback on the fact that he's working with our our DA, which is Scarlett, who actually lost our case. And thank God that Jared came in and won the case. And I thought it was a winnable trial, actually. And Jared didn't even have to take it to trial. So I'm like, he didn't have to take it to trial and won, and she took it to trial and lost. And that was kind of strange to me, but I had a little bit of bias there, but he continued to work with it. Thank God he did. But I'm glad that they brought to light the things that's happening, and maybe that's where it needs to start. at the DA's office and in the arrest process and in the bond situation. I hope there's hope. I think so.
So there are three things that kind of give me hope. So the first thing is when I go on social media, and at the beginning I talked about Reginald, who pled guilty, and I see that he didn't get caught up in the criminal justice system. He's working, he has a family. Last time I saw his profile, he had a son that graduated. So that gives me hope, because when I think back 20 plus years ago when I first met him, I wouldn't have had hope in that situation, because he ended up failing probation and actually going to prison. And so coming out of that and to see him now as a man gives me hope, as someone who did not become a part of the recidivism. The second thing, I talked about the three officers, and at the time seeing them as voiceless. And I still believe that they did not understand the power of their voice, but when it was time to speak, they tapped into, whatever inner spirit they had to make sure that justice was done, putting their lives literally on the line, and that's not an exaggeration. They were in a position where they actually could have been harmed, and I believe that, and they believe that. So there was hope, and when there was time to do the right thing, they did the right thing. When there was time, when someone gave them a platform to speak, they spoke. So that was hopeful. And then the last thing for me that happened most recently are the George Floyd protests. It was a time that you didn't just see Black people protesting, you saw the world protesting. All genders, all ethnicities, across the world, who had seen an injustice and they were not going to stand for it any longer, and they were going to make their voices heard. So I think we still have a long way to go. As far as recognizing the number of civil rights violations that take place and acknowledging the fact that it does actually happen. But I do think we're moving in a direction where we have a generation or a collective generation of people who are now deciding that that is not going to be the norm and it's not going to be hidden any longer.
Absolutely.
I'm curious.
I was going to say Roy Austin gives me hope, but we worked together really closely on this case, and I joked earlier about him yelling at me, but I'm not sure I've ever heard him yell at anyone. He was relentlessly upbeat and been an amazing supporter of Abel, so I don't know what to do if he's not optimistic. But for me, what makes me optimistic is young people and changing demographics. I teach at Georgetown Law, and I've watched as when I first taught criminal procedure to 100 first years, they would sort of look at me like I'd lost my mind when I was talking about how messed up the criminal legal system is, and now they're like, why aren't you, doing more, right? And I actually love that. So they've evolved so much, and they're just so different. I think there's a lot of hope in that. I think changing demographics are obviously key. I watched a hearing in California that occurred a couple of weeks ago, in a hearing about whether to restrict police canines from biting people. And it was an entirely different conversation because of the racial and ethnic makeup and just life histories of the individuals who were on that committee than it would have been 5 years ago, or today, with a different set of people out there. So those things give me a lot of hope. I can't say that I'm optimistic or that optimistic, because I know power is really entrenched and it really doesn't want to let go. So I don't think it's just going to automatically happen. If it is going to happen, it's going to be because of young people and because we have more Black and Latina people in positions of power and influence.
You're here. Well, I think we have, I hope we have time for some Q&A. Let's see a time card. And we have a microphone right in the middle. So I think let's check the time here. Oh, we've got maybe 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Maybe a couple questions, and then we'll wrap up. So if folks want to make their way to the center, please.
Okay. First off, thank you all so much for the extraordinary panel and discussion. My name is Ruben Roy. I'm an undergraduate here studying computer science, and I'm also a budding activist in a lot of the issues that were discussed. My question was about the use of data, which was, I think, one of the questions the panel talked about. It was really, really interesting to hear about the work that you've put in making data, in applying data to make policing more equitable and sustainable. My question was, I guess, about how data might be used the other way around. So I've read and I've gotten to see a lot about how police forces and the criminal justice system are applying various algorithmic tools in ways that perpetuate inequity. For example, applying sentencing algorithms that apply some type of racial bias through the use of zip codes as the decision factor for whether someone gets bail or how long their sentence is. So my question for really the panel, and Roy in particular for you, because I know you're obviously in a tech-adjacent role right now, is where you feel the role of advocates needs to be in making sure that these really powerful technologies are being applied in the criminal justice system in a way that perpetuates equity instead of preventing it.
So, thank you for your question. You have a great last name. Look, I mean, we have to throw away most of the data that we have right now. It's really the starting point.
Wow.
Because if you look at that data, I mean, look, if you police, most of America has committed some crime or another. If you police only in the black and brown neighborhoods, guess what your data is going to tell you? That the black and brown people are the people who commit crimes. That's the data that's being entered into all of these systems. We have to basically scrub all of that data and start new if we're actually going to figure out what needs to be done to reduce crime, to reduce violence in this country. And so that's the first thing, but no one wants to do that because that's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to take a lot of time, and people are stuck in their whole idea that these communities are violent communities, are inhumane communities, don't deserve the resources that everybody else has. But that's where I would actually start, is we need a brand new data set. Chirag Baines left the White House. He could have fixed it had he not left, but he decided that he wanted to do other things. But that's the kind of thing that we need to do, in my opinion. But Jared's using data for good right now, so.
Well, I mean, to me, the stuff that scares me the most are the things like the predictive models. I mean, the first time I really came face to face with the biggest policing conference, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and I saw a crime predictive model, and I looked at it, and they were going to tell me who was going to commit what crimes tomorrow, and I thought, well, if you arrested 100 people in this neighborhood, isn't it just going to tell you to go back to that same neighborhood tomorrow? And they're like, I mean, like, yeah. And so I think what we need are people on the inside designing these systems and building these systems specifically with the civil rights protections in mind. I mean, these things are happening in our country, and we need data scientists and we need technologists who understand both the potential, but really the potential harm, and that has to be built in our system. Because if we do not build it into the system, then yeah, we're just going to keep perpetuating the harms of the past, and it will actually be easier.
Do we have time for one or two more questions?
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Sue Cohen. I have no background in law, but I know a thing or two about injustice because I am the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And I have two different questions. First of all, I do want to thank you all. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I guess I have to go back to school, but I'm feeling a little old to do that. My first question is, I grew up at a time where there were communities, where community police lived in the community, and they knew the people of the community. And my feeling over the last 20 years is the police have turned into a militaristic occupying force who come in and treat the people of the community as their enemy, whether it's the over-militarization of all the equipment they got, how it ever works. But do you think that coming back into more community where police need to live as part of the people they do police would build some more justice or a more just system? That's my first question.
Yes. From both a social work standpoint and a law enforcement standpoint, it's kind of what people, when I would do interviews, there's something, if I interviewed each of you, if you interviewed each other, after about 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to find a commonality. And I think what you see with police versus the community is sometimes you do think it's a us versus them. But when you get to talking and you have a real conversation and you get to know them as people outside of the crime, I'll keep going back to my formative law enforcement days as a probation officer. I was 21 years old. Most of my probationers were 18, 19, 20 themselves. We had a lot in common. And I could sometimes sometimes see myself, and it's kind of what Roy says, like by the grace of God, I wasn't in this community at this time, or I wasn't driving down this street at this time. So you have to be realistic of what your community defines, how you fit into that community, and what the people can give back to you. And I do think that that's lost sometimes because you start to see differences where there really aren't differences.
And their kids would all go to the same school. They would share in the same teams or activities. My second question is actually directed more to you, Ashley. In 2006, the FBI did an extensive study that warned of the influx of white supremacists in every aspect of law enforcement, every sheriff's department, every police department, in our military. 10 years later, PBS did a 10-year review. Nothing had changed. And now it's 7 years after that. It is now 17 years later. What is happening to weed out the danger? And that danger is to me, to all people of color, to all people who are different. There is, for want of a better word, evil in the system. There was an SS that wantonly killed Jews across the board during World War II, not the German regular soldiers who frequently were decent and kind, but this SS that bought into a philosophy of murder and mayhem. And right now, I feel this country's biggest danger is that, and the FBI has identified it, but what's being done? And I will sit down to take my answer, but thank you so much.
Everyone's looking at me.
What's the FBI doing?
I'm not going to answer on behalf of the FBI. I will say I'm not familiar with the study, so I can't speak to that. But I will say that since joining the FBI in 2007, that I have seen a commitment and an elevation of resources and prioritization of civil rights in general, specifically color of law crimes. When I talked about my time in New Orleans and I talked about Gary, who let me tag along, largely he let me tag along because he was the only civil rights agent at the time in New Orleans. So he needed the help. So I don't know if it was so much me as he just needed someone to help him. So I can only speak to the work that I see. I do see a change, and sometimes change is slow, and sometimes you may not see it readily, but I do think the work that we're doing when we have the Justice Department and others who look into these departments, one of the education pieces we do, our Civil Rights Unit does, is they'll go to these departments, kind of like Mr. Scott, and give education. They'll talk about civil rights cases. They'll talk about color of law, deadly force. So the new recruits, as they're coming in, become more educated on the issue. So those are things that you may not see them readily in the community, but they are things behind the scenes that I think are pushing justice, maybe slowly but surely.
I would agree with you on what you said. They are infiltrating the police department, and in some cases, I think it's pretty obvious that they are. But I think it starts in the recruiting and also the interview process. And what I find, and what I was working with North Charleston, was that I'm more safer with the younger folks coming in. And I'll tell you, out of 15 recruits, the majority, 6 of those recruits would be 21 and under. I'm like, what would make you want to become a police officer? I was never interested in becoming that. And that always amazes me when I do that in there. But the ones that do worry me and did concern me were the older ones. When they said they're 45 to 50, I'm like, what would make you want to become a police officer at this age? Maybe it's like the guy, he likes guns in his story. He likes guns. And those are the ones that brings fear to me more than any, because then they would fit that role. You know what I mean? Why are you coming in the police force that old of at that age? Mm-hmm. And what are you bringing to offer, or what are you bringing?
Mm-hmm. We have time for one or two more?
Maybe.
Looks like
I feel like I'm bringing it back down to the real concrete here. I'm Jenny Lyman, and I used to teach at GW Law School. I know Jared from somewhere.
She's all right.
But I'm having a problem with kind of a cognitive dissonance here, because on the one hand, I'm thinking about all the statistics we have on, say, gun violence. And they have been put out there, the data has been put out there for decades, that gun ownership does not make you safer, and so on and so forth. Lots of data, and doesn't appear to have carried the argument. On the other hand, I'm hearing about JIL, and I'm we've got data. We're surrounded by data gods, and it sounds like JIL could be a kind of biofeedback for the prosecution and police teams. What is it? How can you use that data? What are the ways that you can use the arguments so that you don't end up just falling on the deaf ears that you have with so many of these issues where, sentencing. We've known for literally centuries that longer sentences don't actually deter. It's the prospect of getting caught that deters people. How do we use the data to persuade?
Well, I mean, I think it starts with having people trust and believe in that possibility. I mean, I think the numbers can be used, can be twisted, can be used to tell stories. And partly where we start in an office is to help them understand what we can do. I mean, when I was a prosecutor, we used to collect a bunch of data all the time. No one ever did anything with it. No one ever used it to help us make better decisions. No one ever used it so that we could be more fair and more just. And partly when we go into an office, we start by trying to understand, what is it? What is the possibility? What can we say when we have a limited sample size? Where are we counting the right things? Where we often start is with, what are your values and what do you care about? Because when we start as our baseline, what do you care about? Then when I tell you what the numbers are, you're much more likely to accept them and work with them. What we see with the polarization of America, what we see with the use of data generally is, people are using them, yelling at each other, and they don't really accept it, they don't believe in it. One of the reasons why we started doing the work we did in Charleston is, there's plenty of data on let's say, pretextual traffic stops and discrimination in Philadelphia. Do the people in Charleston care about what's happening in Philadelphia? Absolutely not. Do they care about, are they serving their communities? Sure. When we ask them to set the parameters of what they think that means, and then we show them that they're not doing it, then they actually begin to say, oh, maybe there is something different I can do. And so I think a real part of this data is making it actionable to the real people who are trying to solve problems. And there are enough people out there right now willing to at least start there that, when we started in Charleston, one of the things that we showed them was what percentage of cases they were dismissing for insufficient evidence. It was like a quarter of the cases that were coming in. And we said, all right, well, you guys don't want those cases in the system. That's why you're dismissing them, right? 1 in 4 people. And it's taking you 220 days. And that's distracting you from prosecuting homicides and doing armed robbery. Why is that? Let's start to understand why that is. And then slowly by slowly, they begin to say, oh yeah, we don't want to do that. Let's begin to fix structures and systems. It was a hard push. It took us years to get there. As soon as we began to show that as a promising alternative to save resources and make their communities safer, 5 other offices said, can you help us do what you did in Charleston? I think that's the only way we can start, is find the people who are receptive to that and begin to show them a way.
Can I add to that it's also, I think, we really have to pair the data with people's stories. And I think that's so important and sometimes missed. All the data in the world isn't, and even the stories don't work always, but it always makes it more likely. When Trug Baines is here, who we worked together on the Ferguson case, and we were reams of data, lots of data, but we knew we had to pair that with stories. And I think as lawyers, the importance of that. So we could talk to people about how fines and fees were dividing the community and not keeping people safe. But then when we told the story of how a woman called the police department because she was being the victim of domestic violence, and when the officer got there, the man had left, but there were signs that he lived there, which was a violation of the occupancy permit. And he threatened to arrest her. And she said, I will never call the police again, even if I am being killed. Like that story, and that was one of our attorneys, Charles Hart, found that story. We went back to people when we had stories like that. We talked to them. I always felt like the findings reports were such an important part of that work because it was our only opportunity to tell stories. It's a very imperfect opportunity, but whenever you have the opportunity to tell people's stories and explain why that data is mattering in real life, you're going to you're going to make more people care than you otherwise would. Still not everybody that should care, but I think it's a really important part of this when we talk about data.
Mm-hmm. Time for 2 more?
2 and that's it.
Okay.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for taking the time to speak with everyone. My name is Joshua Drumming. Like Roy, I'm not overly optimistic when it comes to the state of policing in this country. I think ultimately, we live in a country whose bedrock has been racism since the modern conception of race was created in 1681. And I think that ultimately, no matter whether we're looking at altering algorithms, whether it's talking about police training, so on and so forth, these are ultimately just palliative measures, because the police force is, in my opinion, just a mirror to our society, which is fundamentally racist. In my pessimistic opinion, irreversibly racist. So my question is, what do you think is the feasibility of, dismantling policing and prisons holistically, or if we're looking at it perhaps in a more realistic light, at least reducing it to such a level where literally only the worst offenders are incarcerated? I'm talking serial killers, et cetera, et cetera.
Is the question the likelihood that that will happen?
Not just likelihood, the feasibility. So a ideal society, if we're just looking at the logistics of implementing that, what would you say logistically is the feasibility?
I mean, to go from now to that, I think that's impossible. So the question is the world that you're talking about a world that we would all like to live in? I think most of us would say absolutely. And so I think the question then is, how do we get there? How do we get there? And all I know is that the world that we live in and the system that we have is certainly not the best we can do, and we have to do better. And I don't know everything we can do. I think the work that Christy's doing is amazing. I love the work that we've been doing at Justice Innovation Lab. I love the work that Anthony's doing. I mean, we have to begin to dismantle it from the inside, and we need pressure from the outside. It's the only way that it's going to work. I realized at one point in my whole career, I was actually an outsider operating on the inside. That's sort of always what I did. They send me to a place to investigate civil rights, but I also was the Justice Department. Now I'm an outsider coming into prosecutors' offices, but they're also giving me all their data to try to help them. We have to fight from the inside and the outside, and we have to move things available and take the wins when we can. And the more wins we have, I think are going to lead to more wins. Is it inevitable? Absolutely not. I don't like to use the word optimism because this doesn't happen unless we build a movement of people who are committed to do it. Because if we don't, the moral arc of the universe surely will not bend on its own. And so we just need more people. And as I go out in the world, the thing that gives me hope is I talk to a lot of people who want to make the world a better place, and most of them just don't know where to start. And let's just start finding solutions and find those people, and let's build this alliance.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. It's a great question, and I would just add that I think it's there has to be a ramping down of the current system, right, that happens simultaneously with a building up of whatever 2.0 looks like. I don't think either of them can exist without each other.
Yes.
Can I just, so I wrote a piece called Abolish Carceral Logic. I agree that police are a mirror of our society, and the reason why policing is so harmful is because it's reflecting a lot of the racialized and racist sort of attitudes and the racist foundation of the criminal legal system. And so as we try to change it, we have to change the mindset. And right now it's a carceral mindset. This goes to the data piece as well. I was thinking all that data would be great if we got that data about who was in what zip codes and said, oh, you're in danger of something bad happening to you, or you're doing something bad. What can we do to help you? Instead of how can we better incarcerate you, right? So if we switch that logic has developed because of racial capitalism, and it is going to perpetuate. And the importance of understanding that is as we try to change that into something else, we will replicate the same problems unless we think about the logic behind it. And so I think it's really, I don't know if it's feasible. I'm not feeling optimistic this month, this past 6 months or so, but young people are. And so if we change these things, I think the idea is as we change these to really be thinking about the mindset behind these things, to recognize that it really does come from these roots, and that we have to ensure that whatever replaces it has a totally different approach to how we solve society's problems and how we protect people.
Yeah, last question.
Good afternoon. I have enjoyed this panel. My name is Yolanda Lewis. I work in the criminal legal system on the policy reform side, and I know Ashley Johnson. We went to college together, and it's nice to see her in this environment. I think to start, I just want to thank all of you for what you've done here, not only in the case, but then just kind of bringing this kind of messaging to light so we can kind of use this as a case study for kind of how to navigate things current day. But why do you think that 20 years ago you dealt with this, and now 20 years later we're dealing with it now? What is there's data, there are numbers, but there's a very human element here that is about people, and we're watching it day to day. What's the disconnect between what you saw 20 years ago, what we know to be true today? There are cameras everywhere. We see people having to respond to these violations, but yet they're still happening. What's the disconnect? What hasn't caught up to current day?
I would say, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that sometimes we don't want to acknowledge when we say words like institutional racism. We want to stay away from things like that because it's sometimes questioned as if you're questioning the fabric of the country versus just acknowledging what is. And I think that the data is very important, but I think the human, if you don't understand the community, as you pointed out, and understand how, if you have a community that is considered high crime areas, how does it get that? And I remember I would see an 18-year-old come in for possession of marijuana, and he smokes marijuana, right? But marijuana stays in your system 30 days. He's got to take a test every week. So now this kid that smoked marijuana now uses cocaine, because cocaine gets out of your system in 2 or 3 days. And until you see that, this immature kid who was hanging out, got caught with weed in his pocket, is now addicted to cocaine and committing more egregious crimes. Until you understand how that community works, how our system in some way influences that, I think you'll always be in kind of that circular atmosphere, because I think the police, in that case, they're seeing the crime escalate. So what they're seeing is, okay, we've gone from here, now we're escalating to here, but not understanding the stairway that it took to get there. And I say, if you don't understand that and take the time to understand who is being impacted, because it's not all Black and brown people. We can even deduce that down to the specific Black and brown people that are targeted on a day-to-day basis. And until we look at that and why, and ask the question why, I think that we have, we're kind of working kind of in a vacuum almost.
Thank you very much. I just want to give a hand to all the panelists.
Reception after this? There's a reception after this, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I want to also just thank the panelists, because of all the things that I learned today. I learned that wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you're equipped with, you can do something, right? And we don't all have to have the same perspective in order to do something. We are living in a society where there is plenty of work to do, and each person on this panel, whether a teacher, a data scientist, a community member, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, has found the place in their heart to do something about the huge problem, and every little bit hurts. So whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, whether you're a student or a teacher, whether you're a mom, a dad, an old or young person, whoever said they were too old, I'm sorry, no you're not, right? The fact is that the people in this room can make a difference and use their lives for good. So I want to thank the panel for teaching me that, for teaching us that, and for exemplifying it today. Thanks very much.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if you feel so inclined, there are books for sale outside. There's even a discounted publisher's rate. I'll be available for signing. One of the things that we did at Justice Innovation Lab, and really the reason why I wrote this book, was because I think we need to be having different and better conversations in this country about how we can tackle these problems. We have created Phase 1.0 Conversation Guide. Love your feedback on how we can make it better, but ways to lead conversations with your friends, with your communities, on how we can begin to start tackling some of these problems.
That's great. And the last thing I was going to plug was Anthony.
Yeah, plug that book too.
I just learned about this today. Otherwise, we would have put it up on the screen. Anthony also wrote a book, The Beast I Call Grief, which I believe is available on Amazon.
Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.